Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. The Platypus Student Club at Boston College runs a Marxist reading group and public fora year-round. If you'd like to be included on our emailing list or get involved in our activities, please sign up at the following link, which I'm going to drop in the chat right now. There we go. You can also find the Platypus Review, our forum in print, online at platypus1917.org, which, for our sake, I will go ahead and drop in the chat as well. So first, just to go over some Zoom housekeeping, you'll notice the way we have it set up is kind of, essentially we want to run as effectively as possible, but we have a sort of webinar / town hall meeting hybrid is what we're trying to do here as a kind of experiment. So because we have this technically as a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar, as you can see, everyone's visible to everyone else. Of course, you can you can decide to turn your video off or on. And the other thing, you can also, as most of you probably know, you can toggle between gallery view or speaker view. Just if you go to the top, if you wanted to either look at the person speaking through speaker view or to see everyone kind of Brady Bunch style. And personally, I do encourage speaker mode for the initial presentations by the panelists, and then maybe gallery mode for the Q&A, but that's just kind of a suggestion. Otherwise, in terms of etiquette, don't do anything you wouldn't do in a real life panel, and please turn off your video if you go to the bathroom or anything like this, because we have heard horror stories, and they're real. Also, if you have any concerns about something, whether it's tech or something else, you can type in the chat box and that will go directly to us hosts. So now for the panel description entitled Popular Frontism in the Age of Trump. Since the Nazi seizure of power over 80 years ago, the anti-fascist Popular Front has been a component of left-wing politics. After Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Stalin's Comintern announced the People's Front Against Fascism and War, or Popular Front, a strategy calling for socialists to form broad coalitions with liberals and centrists, which served as official communist policy until 1939 when World War II broke out. In the lead up to the 2020 presidential election, the left seems to have once again resurrected the politics of popular frontism, this time between anti-fascist and anti-racist street protesters on the one hand, and the presidential campaign of Democratic candidate Joe Biden on the other. The two sides of this modus vivendi seem to have formed a de facto coalition around preventing the re-election of Trump at all costs. How is popular frontism the same or different today? Why popular frontism now? What does it have to do with socialism? And I wanted to just add as a quick rejoinder that we ourselves in the Boston chapter of Platypus, we've been ambivalent about posing the panel this way, especially in terms of using the term popular frontism, since most of the constituent elements of the original Popular Front, like the rise of unequivocally fascist regimes, the existence of mass communist and social democratic parties, very much aren't what we see today. Yet we have recently been hearing and seeing this term Popular Front being used among different leftist circles who in the lead up to the election in some way seem to imagine their strategy in these terms. So in one way or another, this rhetoric has come up in a kind of curious manner that we decided demanded interrogation. And one way we decided to deal with this was by posing it as an ism. So not the Popular Front, but Popular Frontism. And with that in mind, Platypus's intentions are neither to affirm nor condemn the legitimacy of the term or the associated strategic ideas, so much as to pose the question of the meaning of popular frontism in the left's own self-understanding today, with the hope that by putting it on trial, we may glean something about the current state of the left in terms of its political imagination and historical self-understanding. Now, to introduce our panelists in the order they'll be speaking. First, Rui Martinez is a socialist activist studying government at Harvard. He's the co-chair of his YDSA chapter, an editor for YDSA's national publication, The Activist, a member of the Reform and Revolution Caucus in DSA, and a founder of the Revolutionary Power Caucus in YDSA. He considers himself a Trotskyist. George Katsiaficas is a former student of Herbert Marcuse and a retired professor of humanities and sociology at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. He's been active in social movements since 1969 when he participated in the anti-Vietnam movement. He's the author of The Subversion of Politics, European Autonomous Social Movements and the Decolonization of Everyday Life, as well as The Global Imagination of 1968, Revolution and Counter-Revolution. Eddie Carson is an independent historian, residential faculty member, and dean at the Governor's Academy. He's the current Dean of Multicultural Education and member of the History Department. He's the co-author with John P. Irish of Historical Thinking Skills, a workbook for European history. And he's currently working on a book chapter entitled W.E.B. Du Bois, A Reluctant Communist. He edits for the Christian Century magazine, Then and Now, and sits on the Christian Scholars Conference Committee. Carson chairs the Communist Party USA's Boston chapter. Finally, Jack Ross is a freelance editor and independent historian in Brooklyn, New York. His work has appeared in The American Conservative, Tikkun, The Mitrailleuse, Daily Caller, Mondovice, and antiwar.com. He's the author of Rabbi Outcast, Elmer Berger and American Jewish Anti-Zionism, as well as The Socialist Party of America, A Complete History. So the way this panel will work is that we're going to have each panelist speak for 10 minutes and give their opening remarks. So to the four panelists, I will signal with this sign when you have 2 minutes left. So please be on the lookout. I'm not sure if you have speaker view, but you might want to do gallery view, because when I'm not speaking, when you're speaking, I don't know that you're probably going to see yourself or whoever was speaking last. So that's just a suggestion. So yeah, be on the lookout for that and try to wrap up your remarks when you see it. We'll follow these initial remarks with a quick round of responses so the panelists can respond to each other at a maximum of 3 minutes. Then we'll open up the discussion to a Q&A with the audience, where you'll be able to ask questions either by raising your hand and voicing it out loud, which we definitely encourage, or by typing it in the chat box and having me read it out loud. So without further ado, as I hand it over to Rui, let's thank our panelists for being here and sharing their thoughts with us in whatever Zoom style you find appropriate. All right, Rui, take it away.
All right, thank you, Will, for unmuting me. I want to start by thanking the Platypus Society for putting this together and the other panelists here. It's really an honor to be talking with you all and engaging in this dialogue, which I think is extremely vital. And we have seen the vitality of it in DSA, of having a principled conversation about leftist history and what we do today with the possible re-election of Donald Trump. So I would like to begin by posing my sort of thesis statement on what is happening now, and then as my comrades in Platypus have asked me to talk a bit about the left opposition and thoughts on Popular Front in a critical way. And so what I will say is that, Popular Frontism is a failed strategy. That's not what's happening now, and neither is perhaps a popular frontism, but even that would be a bit of a stretch. And what we should do is we should stop the election of Donald Trump while being extremely and fully critical of Biden, his neoliberal politics, and start building towards a socialist alternative. So that's the thesis. So I think I want to start off by talking about what a popular front is. And a popular front is, at least in the original context, was a formal agreement of governance or of coalition. In France, in the government of Léon Blum, it was a parliamentary agreement, right? It was a government formation the way we talk about it in parliaments today. A popular front was formed from the inclusion of communist, workers' parties, and also liberal and centrist parties in the goal of stopping fascism. And so that has to be said. So the Popular Front originated as a reaction to the third period ultra-leftism, most famously, the KPD, the social fascist line, which said that, a worker, because they thought that the revolution was about round the corner with the Great Depression and the stock market crash. There was this big idea that the SPD, due to its horrific actions at the time in the murder of revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, that they were social fascists, that they were simply the moderate wing of fascism, and that what needed to happen was a struggle against them as well. And that is actually why they called for the Hitler government or called for the re-election that would get Hitler elected and enabled by the Zentrum Party. So that's the thing. But there's actually a history before that, something called the United Front, erroneously so, in China, where the Chinese communists asked for direction into what they should be doing in regards to working with the Kuomintang, which is the Nationalist Party of China, or KMT as it's called, in dealing with warlords in the north. And the leadership of the Soviet Union called for them to stand down, to not militarize, which resulted in a nigh extermination. And actually, funny little tidbit, they had these 32 Moscow scholars, I think they were called, who were Chinese sort of Soviet scholars. They studied in Moscow, and they led the Chinese communists so badly that it actually did result in Mao's very unorthodox ideas, and some might say revisionist ideas, to gain traction, simply because his leadership was seen as a better alternative. So that should be sort of set at the front. There is a sort of history behind it, and a sort of history of avoiding angering this sort of nationalistic element or current governmental element, because people really did think that the Chinese communists were in no position to win, even in the 20s. Certainly so in the 20s in the UK strikes, which were stopped by the Communist Party and the Comintern's will. And there's a lot of other examples that go on with this. In the way that this manifested in Spain, most famously, is in the Popular Front between the Communist Party and the Republicans, and as well as with the Popular Front government in France. This did not work. So I will be repeating many of the traditional Trotskyist criticisms of the Popular Front government or attempt coalition in Spain, in the sense that the communists did not have the leveraged power to call for the independence of Morocco or for the redistribution of land. And this was seen as necessary to keep the Republicans on board. But, one must ask, considering that Franco's notorious Army of Africa was led by 100,000 Moroccans who were, personally loyal, had served under Franco before, one must wonder what would have happened if the Communist Party, and POM as well, POM was guilty of this. This was the Party of Workers' Unification, which was a sort of pseudo-Trotskyist, pseudo-Bukharinist party. It was like a sort of mix. They didn't call for this either, even though Trotsky was telling them, like, hey, the leaders, you should do this. One might have wondered what have happened if a real socialist policy, a true internationalist policy of saying independence to Morocco, redistribute the estates, maybe these peasants would not have been swayed so much by the government, that the rebels that were supported by the Catholic Church, if they had something else to fight for apart from vague aspersions to a republic or, to communism in name only. In France, a very comedic example I will share with you all is that the communists fought and won the concession of raising the minimum wage by around 50%. But what they did not account for is that they also wanted price controls of 50% to prevent immediate price increases, but they did not win that. So the minimum wage went up by 50% and prices went up by 49%. And in general, the people, there was not this sort of massive support for the communists. If anything, they lost a lot of the sort of impetus they had, which sort of led to the government of Pétain, which was this right-wing general when the Nazis won, which ended up resulting in a lot of France not requiring immediate Nazi occupation. This didn't work in Bulgaria, where fascists straight up took power. It's of dubious concern if it did anything in Romania or in other countries where fascists would take power during World War II, other than stifling the communist movement. So, and in the US, the way this manifested is the Communist Party, which had been so aggressively against the New Deal, started turning immediately towards this sort of extreme patriotism, something which is now called Browderism, and support for the New Deal, with some, minor disagreements and expansions, which you can study a lot in sort of the history of the Communist Party in the 30s, which was obviously in very big contradiction to their heroic anti-racist work that they were doing in the Deep South. So, it resulted in a lot of interesting events. The current situation, I think I want to get at now, if I've hopefully convinced you that the Popular Front did not work, as opposed to, say, a united front of workers' organizations and of proletarian organizations. The current situation is that Trump is not a fascist. And what fascism is, I'm hitting a lot of points here. Fascism is the movement of the petty bourgeois, the small business owner, the intellectual or whatnot, that is seeing the failures of capitalism and connecting it to the need to organize, but they are organizing in reaction. In Nazi Germany, we saw that the Nazis destroyed their left wing, headed by the Strasserites, by the Strasser brothers in the Night of Long Knives. So the moment it takes power, it destroys proletarian organizations, it destroys its proletarian wing. There is no petty bourgeois movement like that in the US. The movements that exist are fringe, they're sects, they're not organized, such as in the QAnon conspiracy. They don't have a political program. Trump himself is not pro-fascist, but what he does do is he empowers these groups, these fascist groups. Their prominence has risen significantly. So I think we can't say that we oppose the rise or the second Trump turn, apart from the fact that he would certainly hurt workers. I'm running out of time. I have around a minute. And what we should do to do that is we should maintain the independent socialist line, avoid the Popular Frontist support of Biden, which certain CPUSA articles have done in their headlines and decks, which they should know, and they do know, influences how most people will read the article. With no offense to my CPUSA comrade who is also on this panel. What we should do is we should call for a swing state vote for Biden with full condemnation. We should talk to the people in our families and unions about how Biden is a neoliberal candidate who will disappoint the working class. And in safe states, we should call for a third-party vote for either Hawkins or Lariva, the two strongest socialists on the ballot. And beyond that, just to close this off, voting is but one aspect of the election. Trump will not be defeated if he contests the election by voting. He will be defeated by a mass movement of people, and most likely by the fact that he has no base of power within the state apparatus. So I urge folks to consider these points and to support a similar tactic in their lives and in their discussions and organizations. 10 minutes in. Thank you, guys. And I can't wait to see more of the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Rui. So next we have George Katsiaficas, and it looks like, George, you're able to get in here, which we're glad to see. And just to let you know, because I think you missed the beginning, we are limiting these to 10 minutes, the opening remarks. So if you can look up for this sign I'll hold up after 8 minutes. So let's get George unmuted. George, are you there? So George, I've clicked unmute. There should be a pop-up that says where you have to choose
Can
to.
you hear me now?
Great, yes, thank you. Unfortunately,
Yes.
we can't see you. I wonder if there's any way to turn on your video.
No, I have called in on my phone. Somehow it didn't work for whatever reasons for me to have a video hookup. But maybe you could hold up a something. But let me just, if I may, use the time to say a few things. I don't even think I'll use 10 minutes. I'm sorry to have missed the beginning, so I don't know what was said. But given the general nature of the free program invitation that I received, I was asked to say a few words about the new left, that is the movement of the 1960s, and the relationship to the old left, that is the Communist Party, Socialist Party, and previous waves of revolutionary movements. And it's a very complicated question. There isn't a simple answer, but I think it's fair to say that in the United States, as in South Korea, there was a great rupture between, let's say, communism and new movements that emerged. Particularly if you look at the April 19th movement, 1960 in South Korea, where students at a very high cost of bloodshed, more than 300 killed in the streets, led a revolution to overthrow the US-backed dictatorship of Syngman Rhee. And it, stimulated a popular movement toward reunification. And a year later, there was a US-backed military coup d'etat that put in another dictator, Park Chung-hee. But the point is the disconnect between the student movement of 1960 in South Korea and North Korea was very obvious and very, it was something they tried to make up for. In the United States, McCarthyism, which after all was very tied to the Korean War, also accounted for a lot of the destruction of the Communist Party, for what was left of it anyway, after the debacle that it suffered because of the Stalin-Hitler Pact and the CP swinging from I don't know, some kind of lukewarm support for Hitler because of their allegiance to Stalin at a time when that pact had been signed, then swinging the other way, Browderism, as I heard Ray say a moment ago, patriotism, extreme patriotism. This is a weakness of centralized organization, that when you have an organization that is looking at the central committee, particularly of a foreign country, for their leadership, for their understanding of what's the right thing to be doing, it creates a situation where everyday people are wondering, what's going on here? This is not about freedom. This is about obedience to authority. So in my own experience and from what I've read, the new left and the old left had a somewhat antagonistic relationship, sadly. It's very sad, for instance, that for a long time China saw its worst enemy as the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union thought its worst enemy was China. And I think world history may have been very different if the two major communist powers had somehow formed an alliance in their prime rather than being, at each other's throats. But anyway, the new left did not have one centralized organization. It had a multifarious collection of, parties and groups and collectives, of ad hoc coalitions. And it's a very different organizational form than the old left. This is one of the key differences. The new left believed in the liberation of African Americans, as did the old left, but not simply on the basis of class politics. It was something today is called identity politics. So the struggle against racism, was in itself very important. And in fact, the movement, the New Left movement in the United States, really divided for the most part along racial grounds. African American organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee expelled all their white members because they felt that in the civil rights movement, whites' voices accounted for more, even among African Americans. And so they felt Black autonomy was very important. And of course, the leading organization, African American organization of the New Left, was the Black Panther Party, which was a Marxist-Leninist organization, which had an old left organizational form, but which led a vibrant rainbow coalition, first formed in Chicago by Panther leader Fred Hampton, who was assassinated, murdered by the FBI and Chicago Police Department while he was asleep in his apartment in Chicago on December 4th, 1970. And the Rainbow Coalition included a variety of different organizational forms. The Black Panther Party had sponsored a Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in September 1970, where over 10,000 people, including Palestinians, Puerto Ricans, feminists, gay people, hippies, you know, everybody who could make it made it there and wrote a draft of a new constitution. The new constitutions, the documents were very explicitly anti-nationalist. You know, it began by saying the United States is a federation of bandits, and the wealth of the United States should be redistributed to the third world, where it had been stolen in the first place. It called for the abolition of the army, of a standing army, and its replacement by people's militia. I think the politics of the Black Panther Party can be summed up in their slogan, "All power to the people." That was something that distinguished the New Left in that it was a movement based upon activism, on action. The belief was that if you acted, not waited for the right moment and for the party to tell you when to act, but if you acted, then the popular movement would be generated through action. So anti-war mobilizations, anti-racist mobilizations, feminist mobilizations, all kinds of grassroots impetus led to the largest strike in the history of the United States in May 1970, after the shootings at Kent State University, the invasion of Cambodia, and the shootings at Jackson State University. 4 million students, 500,000 faculty went on strike, supported in many places by unions. And it was not at all for economic gain. It was a strike for opposition to the war in Vietnam, for opposition to universities doing war research and developing weapons, against repression of the African American movement, and in particular of the Black Panther Party. There was no demand for lower tuition or students having more money, anything like that. This was a very political strike and helped lead to usher in a really new era. I mean, not just the 18-year-old vote, which was one outcome, but ultimately getting Nixon out of power through the Watergate scandal.
Just two more. Good, George. Thank you.
Okay, so I think the main comparison between the old left and the new left would be that the new left was composed of autonomous groups, individuals. It was, the American, no one is the boss of me kind of movement. So there was no Stalin who would say, no, we should, do this or do that. Ho Chi Minh was loved, but not obeyed. And he was, if anyone was the leader of the worldwide, let's say, anti-war, anti-capitalist movement in the 1960s, it would have been the people of Vietnam, whose initiatives, particularly the Tet Offensive in 1968, helped create what I've called a world historical movement that even today we see in terms of all these people power movements in the world. exactly the slogan of the New Left, of the Black Panthers, all power to the people. So it redefined world politics and world revolutionary aspirations. That's it. I mean, I could say more, but I think it's a good start.
Great. Thank you very much, George. And if you could go ahead and just unmute yourself, or sorry, mute yourself, and you should be able to unmute yourself later and throughout the discussion. All right, next we have Eddie Carson. Take it away.
Thank you, Will, and thanks for the introduction. Thanks to my colleagues and folks for participating in this. Before I move forward, just one clarity of information. As I'm still in leadership here within the Communist Party here in Massachusetts and nationally, but I'm no longer chairing the party, but working closely with my colleagues and my comrades on that. One of the things I want to point out as I delve into this is I want to frame this in three ways. One, I think when we think about the Popular Front and the Communist Party, the CPUSA, we must think about the historical elements that deals with it at a national level and an international level, and especially as it surrounds race. So that's one part. The second part, of course, is how that expansion really challenged the dynamics of the working class and interracial capacity. And then the other part is thinking about the significance of the Popular Front as it relates to the party now in the 21st century. I want to, I'm thinking about my ongoing work and my research. I want to start off with a quote here. But today we return. We return from the slavery of uniform which the world's madness demanded us to don to the freedom of civil garb. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. We sing this country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed in this yet shameful land. This is titled The Returning Soldier, published in the Crisis magazine by editor W.E.B. Du Bois. This prologue offers contradictions and struggles for returning World War I Black soldiers and forgotten heroes like individuals such as Oliver Law. A lot of folks are not wholly familiar with Oliver Law. In the year 1919, as many soldiers made their way back from Europe, the United States witnessed the reemergence of the KKK. 76 Black people were lynched, which was the highest number since 1908. Law, as well as other soldiers, returned to a nation more divided along race and class lines than before they sojourned to the European theater. Du Bois once explained, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Du Bois, the most noted American Black person in the first half of the 20th century, had hoped Black efforts during the Great War might mend the color line. Du Bois, however, one who was reluctant in his growth to communism, eventually landed and joined the Communist Party by 1961, understanding the relationship of the work that had transpired, particularly in the Soviet Union, but especially among comrades here in the United States, here in the CPUSA. But yet, even Du Bois had his own contradictions, as my recent research and soon-to-be published chapter by Oxford University Press illustrated his burgeoning changes in his own identity. Du Bois represented some of the contradictions Law faced as a dedicated labor activist, a Communist Party USA and International Labor Defense member, and one who sought to eradicate both the color and class line in addressing working class struggles. To understand Law and his importance to the dawn of the 20th century, one must contextualize his efforts in advance of democracy, particularly in the age of Jim Crow, as we're starting to see this war abroad, but yet this constant embattlement of conflict that was transpiring here in the United States. So again, one of the things we know, of course, especially during the Great Black Migration, folks like Law and others migrated to northern cities like Chicago, where he engaged in labor activities. As Law and other Blacks migrated to the north to escape lynching, they oftentimes found work, but yet Jim Crow still pursued them, as yet landing in the north allowed them to operate within the CPUSA. Law landed various jobs upon his arrival to the north, particularly while in Chicago. He was joined by the likes of James Yates, who was active in unemployment labor work. The independent, the ILD, and the CPUSA. Yates also participated in a fight against fascism in Spain. Both Law and Yates observed the struggles of Blacks to secure consistent work. During the Great Depression, like many Black folks, Law found work with the Workers' Project Administration and a home in the ILD. Yet by 1939, he had joined the Communist Party USA, and his activism in the party in defiance against the sins of capitalism and imperialism brought about challenges, such as once being beaten for publicly denouncing Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. Labor unions in northern cities allowed for construction of racial barriers that promoted grave challenges to Black employment. The American Federation of Labor manipulated the color line by using Black people as strike breakers, heightened racial tension. As early as 1902, roughly 43 national labor unions had no Black members, and 27 others barred Black membership. Law faced with difficult odds, elected to encourage racial unity as a way to organize working class people. As a member of the ILD and the CPUSA, his approach focused on class, which he used to remedy the color line problem. This commitment and leadership would later be observed during his second stint in the US military. I'll give you an example. Think about Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens was challenging fascism in 36, Berlin Olympics Games. And we think about Langston Hughes was drafting his work, I Wonder, a critique of the Spanish service and fascism, and how he talked about racism. Law recommitted his efforts to the same military actions Du Bois attempted to explain during the Great War. We know Du Bois made a huge mistake during World War I, and yet he would learn from that mistake during World War I as he expanded to become a Pan-Africanist. Du Bois, who publicly endorsed, unfortunately, racist President Woodrow Wilson, later would denounce such a decision, and yet he still struggled at times in terms of his defense of the Scottsboro case. And yet he understood the significance, though, of Southern Party organization among the Communist Party. Du Bois, however, was a bit silenced during the Spanish Civil War, further echoed his strange dialectical contradictions, while folks like Oliver Law's voice articulated the making of a hero. Law was a CPUSA member and a working class advocate for the struggle. And yet, in doing the struggle, I bring you back to this. The Black narrative on the Western Front was an absent historical narrative. Law felt compelled to join an international brigade aimed at defying the rising tide of European fascism. Historian Robin D.G. Kelly wrote, and I quote, "Ethnic nationalism and internationalism were not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, the Black left in general and Black volunteers in particular saw nationalism and internationalism as two sides of the same ideological coin." This particular position here really made quite a bit of sense as the Communist Party USA aimed to work and mobilize among Pan-Africanists, such as W.E.B. Du Bois. At the time of the Ethiopian and Spanish wars, Black author and CPUSA member Richard Wright had launched his own indictment against the American South. And even folks like W.B. Du Bois gave some conflicts at times too regarding a pacifist response. Yet, both realizing the need to organize amongst multiple nations and multiple political affiliates, they really brought the sense of left organizing to capacity. While Wright and Du Bois were addressing the color line problem in an intellectual capacity, we know that Law committed himself to the international fight in Spain against fascist dictator Francisco Franco. In 1937, Law was promised to captain the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, making him the first Black person to lead white men in conflict. Many of his comrades, understanding that he was a communist, felt a sense of resilience following a Black communist in a battle. And oftentimes moving forward, Law is still remembered as that is the case for W.E.B. Du Bois. As I think about this and frame this even now here in the 21st century, that past interracial capacity and reconciliation among a number of folks brings us to where the party is now. The party, a Marxist-Leninist party, we operate under the sense that under the current conditions, particularly here in the United States, under modern imperialism and capitalism and the realities of a racist fascist operation that's in place, people must mobilize in a way to pull liberals and progressives together. That means voting for Biden, supporting Biden, really working in many ways to stop the degradation of certain things that are problematic, such as limiting the rights, the reproductive rights of women, for example, really allowing the embodiment and a voice of LGBTQ plus folks to continue to have a narrative, working within the constitutional frameworks to really slowly align with progressives to bring about systematic changes that are necessary, really starting to curtail the problems of environmentalism and the challenges environmental problems are bringing to the country, really working to think about local construction and national infrastructure to homeless folks. And really thinking about this in a sense that the Communist Party, much like that of Du Bois and Oliver Law, really looked to meet people where they were, to move them to the left and make them into progressive leftists in a way that wouldn't undermine the particular plight of oppressed and marginalized people, such as myself, such as women, such as members of the LGBTQ plus community. This reality, of course, that we're facing that deals with acts of fascism that's in front of us continues to be problematic. And yet, and while I agree with my colleague earlier, to call Trump a fascist would be a mistake. However, there are definitely aspects of fascism that define Trump, and those aspects really go on in terms of, again, limiting our undocumented immigrants in so many ways. And bringing to the reproductive rights of other folks too. Thank you, folks.
Sorry to interrupt you there at the end, Eddie. Thank you. That was an uncanny, right when your timer went off, was when I was about to be a timer myself. Thank you. So now we have our last panelist. I turn it over to Jack Ross.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on the panel. I would start just thinking about the whole question or subject of this panel. I was reminded of a Platypus comrade who once responded to me talking about the like Resistance Inc. notion about Trump and Putin is a new holy alliance, and he replied, against what revolution? And that's pretty much how I feel about the idea of a popular front, 21st century, against what exactly? The major development in terms of class politics or any kind of death or life of the left is basically the fact that over the last 5 years, the two Bernie Sanders campaigns, what I would recommend the recent Jacobin article by Matt Karp, really underscoring just the election data that backs it up. It really was the weary last stand after 200 years of any identification whatsoever of the Democratic Party with the cause of working men and women. Following up on what Rui said in his remarks about what fascism is, who were the actual constituencies that backed Hitler or fell for Nazism, the peasant proprietors of the European sense, the upper middle class, professional class, particularly small towns professional class, and intellectuals, university population. That sounds an awful lot more like a democratic constituency than anyone backing Trump. So I was asked to talk about the history of the Socialist Party, subject of book I wrote several years ago, and the Popular Front. At the beginning of the 1930s, a large faction of young people entered the party who were known as the militants, who basically were premature reform communists in their actual beliefs or their attitude toward the Soviet Union, and who did by and large believe in a united front, even though it was at the very time that the Communist Party was, as Rui said, united front that was anything but. It was only a few weeks after the brawl between the socialists and the communists on the outside the French Assembly that Madison Square Garden in February 1934 was met with violence. And in 1934, there was, this all came to a head inside the Socialist Party over debate over new declaration of principles, which on the question of whether there was a circumstance in which force or violence was appropriate toward the abolition of capitalism. Well, I can quote whether or not in such cases a majority will not shrink from the responsibility of organizing and maintaining government under the workers' rule. And as a biographer of the Socialist Party leader Norman Thomas acidly comments in what is all too apropos to many of the people talking about taking to the streets in the event of a Trump victory in a few days, the seat of the 1934 Socialist Convention where this was debated, the scene had its grotesquerie. A party which claimed 23,000 members, not all of them in robust health, disputing as to whether and under what circumstances they should assume command of the nation's resources and its 125 million inhabitants, crush the reckless force of reaction and rescue the United States of America. Now, the just complete coming apart of the Socialist Party around this question, suffice it to say as to why I won't really go into the weeds. Really, it's no accident, is the longest chapter of my book. But there were many factions to the left of the militants who had plenty of common ground that was structured for a variety of reasons between them and the more traditionally social democratic old guard. And in the end, it was the old guard that by 1936 actually found itself in a coalition with the Communist Party in what was called the American Labor Party in New York. And one figure I should talk about is, one figure I should talk about is Leo Krisky, who by odd machinations became the national secretary of the Socialist Party at the beginning of 1934, before proving to be a communist fellow traveler and very openly identifying with the Communist Party and its front groups all through the 1940s, who was a leading officer of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, as one, and who supported this declaration and coalition, as one socialist at the time acidly wrote, did not say a word of criticism of becoming increasingly conservative and backing Roosevelt, while as national chairman of the Socialist Party, he voted for dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, that's just one example of that's just one example of of what anticipated the odd alliance of the Democratic Party with critical race theorists and other radicals of what is increasingly referred to as the successor ideology. Another quote from disillusioned social democratic members of the American Labor Party describing how right-wing trade union leadership made it a point to parade pro-communists on the platform as speakers and guests. So what did this all amount to? As I write, concluding on 1936 election, when the Socialist Party had definitively collapsed, and by which time the Communist Party had unambiguously become a stronger force on the left. The logic of the Popular Front, so puzzling to old socialists as the 1930s unfolded, has been the substance of the American left forever since. The contempt for political action inherited from the IWW and historic left wing, what eventually became the Communist Party, became the rationale for elevating protest over politics, a radical posture in service to the liberal faction of the power elite. The consequence has been the loss of the belief in actual democratic virtue that defined American socialism. Now, since I wrote that and became connected to Platypus, I've concluded that that is very much an affirmation of the core thesis or point of departure of Platypus, the death of the left in 1919, and what was ultimately ratified by the Popular Front, by no means just in the United States, was basically, in other words, the abandonment of the bourgeois revolution, and once the Popular Front emerged in the 1930s, that simply ratified that decision that the death of the left as the abandonment of the task of completing the bourgeois revolution.
Jack, thank you.
Wait, I'm sorry. Did you?
If you could just wrap up.
2 minutes. I never saw the 2-minute warning.
Oh, I gave it 2 minutes ago. Sorry, you must not have seen it.
My book, if I could conclude about, give me a chance to conclude.
Sure.
About any of this today. The realignment I talk about that's happened in this country is obviously a pan-Western phenomenon, and perhaps not just a pan-Western phenomenon. And as far as Trump, opposing Trump is not a fascist. He is many ways like, in very many ways like Joe McCarthy, too neurotic and a very neurotic, self-absorbed, anti-intellectual demagogue who doesn't really understand what they're doing or what they've tapped into. But McCarthy critically came on the scene exactly when the communist the domestic communist threat in the United States had been marginalized. Whereas the best way of understanding the last several years of our history is what would have happened if McCarthy had come on the scene when the Communist Party and Popular Front were still relevant. So I'd like to read a quote from, I'd like to conclude with a quote from Norman Thomas writing about the time of McCarthy's downfall, which I feel is perfectly captures the delineation of the relative threats to the survival of liberalism and the completion of the bourgeois revolution between Trump on the one hand and the successor ideology on the other. We cannot defend liberty by denying the danger of the organized communist conspiracy, even if at the moment it is weak within the United States. It was a serious liberal error contributing to the rise of McCarthyism that so many liberals so long minimized the communist evil. Communism is a threat and valid. In this double struggle, there are unfortunately some avowed liberals who aid both McCarthyism and communism by persistently minimizing the danger of communism in America and by assuming that because the complex of ideas and actions which we sometimes call McCarthyism is bad on the whole, therefore none of its elements is necessary or even defensible, and because the McCarthys, big and little, have given the wrong answer to communism, there is no need for any answer except a touching faith that truth is mighty and must prevail. So can our freedom be preserved and expanded. In our effort to meet the challenge which communism and other conspiratorial movements present to the Jeffersonian ideal, I think we shall get further by ignoring McCarthyism for the time being and asking ourselves what action rational citizens should have commended, what they should now commend to their government in the face of the communist war on freedom. And I would conclude by saying, if there is any hope for a decent left any time in the foreseeable future of this country, it will have to take need to take more inspiration from the author of those words than from the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her hangers-on in Congress.
All right, thank you, Jack. So thank you to all the panelists. Now we're gonna have some time for you to give brief responses to each other's comments. And please keep these under 3 minutes, so very quick. And I will hold up this 1 minute warning sign this time. But first, as a quick reminder to our audience, so you can start thinking about what question you'd like to pose to the panel. So starting now, you can begin raising your hand with the raise hand icon in Zoom, and we'll create a queue to try to address the questions in the order they're received. And I want to explain quickly how to do this in Zoom because it's not very straightforward. So if you look at the bottom of Zoom, you should see a button that says participants. And I encourage everyone just to do this, just in case you have a question later. And if you click on participants, it should open up a window on your right. And on this new right side window, at the bottom, there's a button that says raise hand. So for whatever reason, it's not very intuitive in Zoom. You can't just click on your screen or something. And in this case, we'll unmute you and allow you to ask your question out loud. Alternatively, you can submit a question in the chat box for me to read out loud. And we ask that if your question is directed at a particular panelist, please indicate this. But just real quick to the panelists, I want to just as myself, as you know, a part of this panel, pose two thoughts that came to mind in your opening remarks. So one was just this question of history, because I'm noticing this is a panel that has a lot of particular historical anecdotes, in this case, very internationally. We've heard, you know, from China to Spain, Spanish, fascist Spain to the American South. So really all over, pretty particular anecdotes that as a way of addressing this history, both before and after even the rise of the original Popular Front. But I guess I'm wondering for the attendees that either, you know, aren't historians or are wondering what the connection is between these anecdotal histories and the question of the left today. And it seems to bring up this question of the goals or the raison d'etre of the left as an ongoing historical phenomenon that historically tasked itself with changing the world via changing social conditions. And I mean, Jack put it in terms of the popular frontism against what, which brought to mind the fact that, you know, popular frontism it's a defensive strategy rather than an aspirational one. And as Jack was raising at the end, this question of abandoning the bourgeois revolutions, which I'm curious to hear maybe what the other panelists have to say about this. It carries this question of for what rather than just against what. And secondly, one thing I noticed was the word and idea of Marxism never came up. And, you know, for Platypus, that's very much one of our main interests is historical Marxism, but also the kind of use and abuse of Marxism, right? And how the contemporary left may justify their actions by making nods to Marxism. And, you know, on the one hand, something like the Popular Front was decidedly post-Marxist and arguably, especially by Trotskyists like Rui, I imagine, utterly anti-Marxist. But I wonder if there's a way in which even the kind of bandying around of the term popular frontism is expressive of a kind of deeper trend on the left to imagine itself as part of this unbroken legacy that goes back beyond the 30s to Marxism, even back to the 19th century. And so, yeah, I wonder if there's a way that something like popular frontism is understood either consciously or subconsciously on the left as somehow connected to something like a Marxist politics, which itself was a very specific thing with a theory about the necessity of a transitional period between capitalism and socialism and the preponderant role of the state as a node for political power, et cetera. Or if it's this direct connection to this tradition is completely buried or obscured. So I just wanted to put those on the table, but let's do some quick responses and feel free to address those or whatever made you curious about your other panelists' remarks. And let's just do this in the same order. So Rui, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Wonderful. I want to thank the other comrades and panelists for speaking wonderful remarks. So to bring this back to a point where anyone, no matter how studied in history they are, can grasp this, our goal as revolutionary Marxists is our immediate goal is the conquest of power by the working class. We understand that society is divided by class lines. And among this, what we are looking for is the conquest of the working class to power. The goal of stopping the petite bourgeois or, you know, sort of petty capitalist movement of fascism is part of that, but it is only but a part of our struggle. The issue with the Popular Front, I think, is that it subordinates so much into progressivism, right? And I know that's the word my good comrade Edward from CPUSA used, progressivism. My goal is not progressivism. My goal is Marxism. And that's why what we call for is, you know, when we talk about Biden, the way we talk about it in our orientation is not just to say, you know, man, Biden sucks. We need progressives like AOC in Congress. We will have to move past AOC and past Bernie, regardless of the things they have done for the movement now. My goal is to talk to those workers, those union workers, those people in my family and say, you know, I begrudgingly vote for Trump because of how bad, or vote for Biden because of how bad Trump is, and to protect the rights of LGBTQ people, women, and there are minorities who are directly threatened. But Joe Biden threatens them too. In fact, any sort of politics threatens them. The only way to liberation is when the working class, the vast majority of society, and of whom there are majorities in the vast majorities in the LGBTQ plus community of proletarian women, of people who are of color, of people who are disabled like me, you know, What we are looking for is for us to take power among our class line and institute a society in which the fundamental principle is from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And we must directly organize towards that path, and we must not obscure it within the framework of liberalism. And so I think that we can have a Marxist perspective to say, yeah, it is better for us if Biden wins, but Biden is evil. He is a bad man. And we need to build beyond that so we can stop having these same tired, crisis-filled conversations as we've noticed they've been in DSA. The struggle for democracy is eventually the struggle for working class dictatorship of the proletariat, of a worker state, of the amelioration of the human spirit. And we cannot sacrifice that because we are so scared of a potential conservatism. So that's my bit. Very polemical, I suppose, but I hope it inspires some thought into the comrades and into those watching the panel.
Great, thanks for Eddie.
Thank you, brother. So a couple things here, and really, we'll going back to some of the things you framed there. When I think about, the historical regards in terms of what I address, I think about the role of the CPUSA in working with some bourgeois liberal groups. And some of those groups really navigated well, especially when we think about the role of a sister like Pat Ellis, who was, right at the forefront with Emmett Till and others in terms of the civil rights movement that was transpiring that took place too. Understanding too that a number of members within the CPUSA had to work within those bourgeois liberal groups among both Black and white workers, but even particularly Black workers, to really drive some certain levels of civil rights legislations in order to transpire to help not only African Americans, but to really support and endorse the plight of women. And even thinking about the 1965 Voting Rights Act that really helped Asian people in a number of ways too. I think back to Lenin's State and Revolution, in a sense too, that one of the things about radicalism is meeting folks in a particular way, then educating them and transforming them in a way where they can operate to certain levels within the state apparatus to drive certain changes in order to take place too. And so, when I use words and language, we think about progressivism and liberalism and all of that stuff too. It's really understanding the functionality of an imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist country such as the United States, and really getting buy-in from certain members who may be kind of on the fringe member, but moving them a little bit more to the left, to a way where we can really drive legislative change to achieve our goal of socialism and driving that. One of the things I think about oftentimes is, I recall getting some criticism from some folks during the 2016 election. And part of that criticism was, there's Eddie Carson, he's a typical CPUSA member. He's a lackey of the Democratic Party. And yet, the day after the election of 2016, some of those same folks who were denouncing Hillary, denouncing some of those other groups, were all marching down in Boston Commons, really screaming about Donald Trump, not recognizing the functionality in terms of how some of those processes work within this electoral system, and how we bring about revolutionary change, and working and thinking about popular frontism within bourgeois groups.
Thank you, Eddie. And George. George, I've unmuted you. You might have to click it again to unmute.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Great, thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
you can. Thank you.
Okay, super. I'm appreciative of all the other panelists, and I must admit I'm a little surprised that there are no female panelists, and I wish that there were. I think the contribution of feminism to rethinking revolutionary theory and practice is fundamental to our present situation. And I feel in some ways that the frozen categories that people have been using, dictatorship of the proletariat, bringing the working class to power, I think if we tried to define specifically what is the working class today, we might have great disagreements. I mean, I would submit, for instance, that the working class is really in China, that's where almost all the products that we buy in the United States are produced. And, Department 1, Department 2 of capital, production and consumption, China's really, so, be that as it may, one of the most outstanding modern Marxists, if I may use that phrase, is Herbert Marcuse, who I had the pleasure of knowing, the privilege of studying with. And his basic point was that the revolutionary subject emerges in the course of revolution. We can't predict in advance who will be the ones in the streets making the revolution, the class forces that we want to think of. The working class for Marcuse, as for Marx, was a vast majority of society who had nothing to lose but their chains, and who were the negation of the existing system. I think those philosophical categories need to be brought back into play in order to understand, how to proceed in terms of the revolutionary project. Finally, again, frozen categories. I'm not sure petty bourgeois and fascism as a petty bourgeois phenomenon. The standard communist, the Dimitrov definition, was that it was the most reactionary part of the ruling class that was seizing power. But be that as it may, I think it's fair to say that Trump is a 21st century American version of Hitler. And the repression, not of the Jews in Israel or wherever, but of Mexicans, and children being caged and taken from their parents, and wars in Yemen, which you can say, okay, well, that's not Trump's war, but it is, and it was Obama's war. I mean, this is it's a systemic problem. It's not simply a man, but Trump has intensified the repression of workers, of gays, of so many people. The economic statistics might belie that, but the atmosphere that he has created, the take on the world, make America great again, America first, which we must remember was the slogan of Father Coughlin and American fascists prior to World War II. So it's, and very clearly, we don't need to use the word fascist. We don't need to say he is Hitler, that he is a Nazi, but he certainly has helped stimulate growth among these groups. And, as he said to the Proud Boys, stand by. And, this is a clear warning. One possible scenario that I think we haven't talked about is what happens if he refuses to leave office. Then can we really speak about a popular front against a Trump attempt to be president for life? And that's something I hope will never come to, but, I think, Jack mentioned popular front against what, and I think that's a looming prospect, possibly.
Thank you, George. Jack?
So I would just come back to the original historical question you posed, which is no mention of Marxism and what was the popular front. And as I said, the popular front was the culmination of what Platypus describes as the death of the left in 1919. Abandonment of the bourgeois revolution, in other words, the completion of the process in which Marxism, to the extent that this is the right paradigm to look at it, that Marxism became
I'm not sure we put a
something.
date on it, Jack, in terms of 1919. I'm not sure how confidently we have a date for it, but point taken.
Oh, okay. Okay. At any rate, so that was, so the Popular Front was one transformation, but Popular Front, at least its externals, however cynical, were probably pretty right-wing by the lights of the present leaders of the Communist Party, to say nothing of larger movements. And as for and 60s is obviously a whole other discussion, but as for today, I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with the viral video that went out from the last DSA National Convention, and all of the pronouns and whatnot. And would anyone, I just watched it, just beside myself, who in the historic American left, certainly before 1948 and probably much later, would recognize this. And then I realized this is really pre-Marxian utopianism, and is really what high intersectionalism is. And that too is something completely new and different, and how it happens here. That's I guess. Well, that's all I really had to say.
Thanks, Jack. So let's turn to the Q&A in the last 35 minutes or so. So we have, just to remind you, you can go to click participants, raise hand, and we'll add you to the queue, or you can type in the chat box and have me read it out loud. So first up, I have Ed Remus on the queue. So if we can get Ed Remus unmuted, I'll go ahead and lower his hand.
Sure, thanks everyone for your remarks. I have a question for George and a question for Jack. Jack, I'm wondering, you drew an analogy between Joe McCarthy in the 1950s and Trump today, but said that the difference would be that it would be as if McCarthy were around during the 1930s when there was a higher tide of leftism or communism. So what today do you see as that analogy to communism in the 1930s? Do you see that in the DSA and Sandersism, or something else, when you say that Trump would be as if Joe McCarthy came during the 1930s? And then for George, I'm wondering, since you said that the working class today is in China, do you see a kind of popular front strategy as, for example, around support for Biden-Harris, as, effectively in the interest of the Chinese working class? How, if one wants to support the Chinese working class today, what political implications follow from that? And do you see the Democrats today as essentially that force for representing the Chinese working class?
Are you able to unmute yourself?
So your question to George is actually a lot of what my answer would be, and what I meant to say is the extent to which we have we're talking about a popular front with the master class of China, and which I guess in those terms I would also pose to George, but well, I guess you could say YDSA, to the extent that it has or has had anything like a plausible claim to be the vanguard party of progressive elite opinion, as the Communist Party was in the 30s, or in a somewhat different sense, SDS in the 60s. And I guess when I make that statement, I think more about the 40s and the 30s, but that I'm not sure makes much difference. But I guess I mainly make that statement just in terms of what the polarization would look like, how ill-served McCarthy, the leadership of McCarthy, would have been to his side when they actually were facing a threat. I didn't talk quite as much as I could ever plan to in my original remarks about the non-communists or anti-communists left over the course of the 30s, and how and the way, and with notwithstanding a lot of the disastrous factionalism or infighting of 1934 and 35, which is most apropos to the decline and ultimately implosion of the Socialist Party, that they really were united. It really was the communists and everyone else, practically speaking, and everyone else knew they had to band together. I'm done.
Cool. That one was directed at Jack, so unless there's any immediate responses from the panelists, we can go to the next question.
Wait, I thought you had a question for George.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. George, would you like to speak to that question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, super. Thank you for the question, Ed. I think it's a very important question, because when we think of of revolution, we have to think in international terms. The Russian Revolution had to fight a dozen or more countries that sent invasion troops to try to overthrow the new government, the revolutionary government inside Russia. And every revolution that has occurred in the 20th century has faced tremendous pressure from the United States and other countries. Let's not forget, the Soviet Union, many people say, was a failure, but whoa, wait a minute. There were some great victories the Soviet Union won. Most importantly, the defeat of Hitler and the Nazis. We like to think it was, Normandy and D-Day, but it was the Russians who took Berlin. It was the Russians who defeated the Soviet army in the East. And, the Battle of Stalingrad is an amazing feat. I think I don't need to go into more detail, but the Russians were the ones who helped to liberate Africa. The Russians, the Soviets, were the ones who helped to defeat third world fascism that the US was propping up in terms of dictatorial regimes. And of course, popular movements played a role in this. And there was no popular front in the sense of, the 1930s France or Spain. But I think the point here is, how will the United States plans to continue world domination be defeated? How will the Chinese working class and Chinese people find the freedom that they want? Is it through destroying the Chinese government in the US attempts to carve China up with Taiwan's independence, Tibet's independence, the Uyghurs' independence, Hong Kong's independence, Mongolia's independence, this is the direction the United States is going. And Biden, ironically, sadly, is more anti-China than Trump in this regard. And of course, this was a terrible dilemma in the last election where Hillary was advocating war with Russia, while Trump was, basically succumbing to Putin's charms, to put it in simpleton terms. So, in terms of what is in the interest of China, I think it's fair to say neither candidate in the United States. That the real question is, if international armed forces defeated Hitler, how will American imperial domination of the world be defeated?
Thank you, George. So for our next question, we have Luke. So Clint, if you can unmute Luke.
Okay. Hi, guys. Thanks for the interesting history. I'd like to bring up 2 points kind of out of context. One was something that Roy said, which was, well, he mentioned the importance of independent working class organizing. And then later, I'd like to connect that to what Jack said about the historical phenomenon of what he called the elevation of protest over politics. And I just wanted to know from any of the panelists, what role you think the Popular Front or Popular Front style politics played in that, like what effect Popular Frontism had on those 2 things, the independent organization of the working class and the elevation of protest over politics. Thank you.
Okay, that's a great question, Luke. My thoughts on protest over politics in America, I mean, obviously it does exist. We've seen the very eclectic, the very progressive, but very unorganized BLM movement with, aspersions to liberalism that has largely, failed to gain major policy concessions in this country, right? And in the places where there were major policy concessions, you might have noticed that there was also a massive socialist presence, an organized socialist presence, such as in Austin with Austin DSA, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, and even then, these have been limited victories. I don't think that necessarily has to do with popular frontism. There's another aspect to that I think Dr. Katsiaficas was talking about in his discussion on what constituted the new left. But what I would say is that the Popular Front seems, in my opinion at least, to have really eroded the independence of the working class organization. It's hard to prescribe why an organization has fallen from a zenith, and I do not attempt to do that with the CPUSA, as I wouldn't attempt to do so. Well, actually, I do attempt to do so with the SWP, but that's beside the point. It's a turn to industry. But my thought on this is that when we do a Popular Front, and to be fair, there is no Popular Front right now. There is Popular Frontism, but there's no agreement. There's no parliamentary agreement between anarchists, communists, and Joe Biden. Not one that I've heard of, at least. The man seems to hate us completely. But what we do notice is that when organizations take on a Popular Front orientation, they have consistently given up their socialist program. And I have a lot of respect for the comrades who organize with CPUSA, but what you'll notice is that there's very little mention of what a communist program or socialist program is. Meanwhile, the way I think we take it is as a begrudging lesser evilism and a willingness to unite with unions in terms of a very needed protest if Trump contests the election. There would need to be a mass movement of people connecting with and fighting not just for democracy, but for something beyond that, for electoral reforms and so on and so forth. And the goal is to connect that. The failure, I think, of a lot of protests has been that they have not been able to connect that to a socialist program. I think what we're doing in Reformed Revolution and a lot of the more advanced DSA formations is the creation of a socialist program, political education, and really trying to get over this sort of endless subordination to the Democratic Party. I have no idea how long the CPUSA has been doing this, but it certainly has not resulted in much progressivism in terms of worker rights or labor rights. So obviously something is seriously wrong with the tactic, at least in terms of that. And I would say that the gains won in the social aspects have not been due to any sort of, work within the Democrats. It has come out of a history, which I'm sure Edward can talk at length about. But it has come from a history of mass movement, of mobilization, in many cases of explicitly socialist, revolutionary, Marxist mobilization by comrades such as the great Malcolm X. So, I'd say the Popular Front does subordinate a lot of what we build in an independent socialist organization, because you are entering into a coalition with the Democrats. And Popular Frontism, by its ism nature, does that. It does a lot of that. So I think we should be very critical of it. So that's me. I've spoken for a little too long, I feel. And so hopefully the other panelists can give some thoughts on this.
Thanks, Drew. That was great. Yeah, any other panelists would like to respond to Luke's question? I'll take that as a no. Okay, Jack.
I was only going to say that the reason I associate the protest over politics is beginning with the Popular Front. And I suppose one could make the case that this wasn't quite true at the time or in the context, but it has more to do with the myth that was built up around the communist role in organizing the CIO, that the whole reason, or the idea that it was very influential academically about a generation ago, which is the idea that that the Communist Party earned or deserved to overtake the Socialist Party because they were actually organizing in the labor movement, as opposed to actually trying to win elections or be at the ballot box, and that's the that they did that, and just the moral judgment that's placed on that. And it again, the case can be made that has more to do with the myth that's right back into the period than what was actually in the minds of people at the time.
Eddie, I'm curious to hear if you have any responses to any of the comments about the history of the American Communist Party of America.
Hey, thanks, brother. I was trying to hit, it wouldn't let me unmute a little bit earlier. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a couple things here. One, I think one of the great things about the CPUSA has particularly been its role in its relationship with African Americans and in supporting the plight of women in this country. There are a couple things that we've got to keep in mind. One, the CPUSA aims to avoid sectarianism at all costs. Well, we realize that we have to work and we have to operate within an apparatus of various different groups. And some of those things means, for example, I want to go back to a couple things that were mentioned earlier. In terms of our platforms and our goal to achieve socialism and to advance the state, thinking about things at the grassroots level, particularly at the state and local level, has been our focus. Focus on things such as workers' right, the idea of expanding the franchise and encouraging voting for democratic practices and processes in order for that to happen. To think about things such as the environmental regulations that have been in place. And thinking about this idea in a socialist society, we want people to get paid for their hard work and to be rewarded for the initiatives they take. And we were really focused on quite a bit in terms of expanding some of those democratic apparatus. Well, it means that people have levels of wages that are there. So that means we have to do a couple things. We have to combat the war on racism, the war on sexism, the problems of homophobia, in the way that corporate sponsorships have injected themselves in a way that have manipulated and divided the working class. And it is true, you know, one of the things I heard earlier is that, you know, what is the working class? And the working class is not monolithic whatsoever. We know that there are aspects of the working class that, particularly the white working class, that voted and supported Donald Trump in the last election. And those were folks who were Bernie Sanders supporters too. And so, you know, for us, it's getting out, really educated and making sure people understand that there is a process. And oftentimes, while we want to mobilize to expand the vote at the state and local level, which can have implications at the national level, it's also imperative that folks understand too that a lot of the things that impact our lives, which really the CPUSA has focused on, especially here in Massachusetts, happen right here in our own local communities.
Thank you, Eddie. I guess one thing we've realized in terms of technicalities on Zoom is, you know, we have everyone muted and we unmute the panelist and whoever's asking a question, but it seems like once you mute yourself after you've spoken, that we have to unmute you again. So that's just to clear that up. So that means, George, we don't have you on video, unfortunately, but hopefully you can send me a chat. You can bug me in the chat to make sure you're getting a word in when you'd like to. But next, I'd like to turn to Mike Heichman. George, did you have something you'd like to say?
No, I just wanted to say I'm not sure how to chat with you. Like I said, I'm on my iPhone.
Oh, well,
phone call. But
the fact that you're able to speak right now, it seems like there's no problem on your end. Then you can unmute yourself. It seems.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you. So next we have Mike Heichman.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Thank you very much. I have some unsophisticated comments, and I'd like to ask the panelists if anybody wants to respond. Popular frontism, for me, simply is the left working together. And sometimes it's a really good idea, and sometimes it's not. The worst example that I see is the left working to support Democrats. And this is not new in this election cycle, the last election cycle. That's true. I'm an old man. I'm going to be 74 next month. It's true in my lifetime that quite a bit of the left supports the Democrats. Two good examples with us today is DSOC that became DSA and the Communist Party. So despite the fact that Bernie ran a social democratic platform, he got screwed. Once again, the left rallies implicitly or explicitly to support the Democrats, the graveyards of social movements. I want to point out some positives. One of the things that upsets me is that as the left moves closer to the support Democrats, the left, which is very weak, the part of the left that is politically independent is also weak. So the Green Rainbow Party, Howie Hawkins is running an eco-socialist campaign, and there are other left parties too. So for me, the Green Rainbow Party is not the answer. It's the direction that we need to move into. So two examples of building the left, popular frontism, okay? One is that I'm active with Boston Mayday Coalition. It's a group that includes many, many different organizations in the left. And we're trying to build left unity. The second is in terms of independent political action, is that realignment. I would love to see DSA, that, you know, there's forces that want to create a democratic socialist party, and also Movement for a New Party and the Green Rainbow Green Party and other political parties come together, not only electorally, but in terms of, once again, in terms of popular frontism. So yeah, so I just want to throw that out and ask if anybody has any response to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Rui, I know you wanted to respond.
Yes, Mike, I agree with you. I think that we do need political independence, and we need to build that. You know, we're in Reform and Revolution, we're of the position that, you know, the orientation we take towards this whole Biden business is, you know, and maybe you'd critique that. Um, and so, I will first address the bit that the something that hopefully I can expand on in further questions is this idea of the united front. You know, I think that's what you're getting at when you're talking about left unity, a united front of workers' organizations, of socialist organizations. You know, I think that might be what you're getting at, and I think that's important. Obviously, we don't just want to unify with this sort of like, you know, if the number is bigger than the other number, we're all good. Obviously, there has to be some principles there. In Reform and Revolution, we're of the position that we're for a dirty break, but we're for an actual dirty break. So there are some folks in DSA who are for what they call a dirty break, which is you work with the Democrats now and to build the forces for a mass party. But that never happens, right? And they're very skeptical of that. It was Reform and Revolution members who wrote that petition, which you're talking about, you know, for the creation of conferences that would discuss creating a democratic socialist party with unions. Because the thing is, the failure of a lot of these third-party attempts has been that they don't have a mass base. Compare that with a group like MAS in Bolivia, which has won its, you know, back its political power in Bolivia after a fascist, or at least something very close to fascism, definitely petit bourgeois, coup supported by American imperialism. They had a base in the unions, especially in El Señor Orlando Gutierrez, which was killed by fascist thugs after being one of the main supporters of democracy in Bolivia. And so, you know, rest in power to him. He is a hero. And this is an example of the mass base that we would need if we want to build a workers' party that has a chance of winning and is not just marginal instantly. And so we want to create that, and that is necessary to the vision that you're talking about, I think.
Thank you, Rui. Eddie, I know you also wanted to respond to this one.
Hey, thank you, brother. And Mike, I'm very familiar with your work. You work with John Comrade in the Communist Party with the Boston May Day Coalition. So I appreciate your thoughts. And like Rue, I agree with a lot of what you had to say. You know, I want to be very honest and frank here, though. And I want to bring it back down to even just a local level here in the greater Boston area. The thing I appreciate about my comrades here on this panel is that we've not attacked each other nor gotten into sectarian debates or pointed fingers at who's right, who's wrong, all of that. And that's just respect that we have here, and I appreciate that. Here's the reality, though. In my experience here in the greater Boston area, though, the challenges in creating a united front has not worked. It is really, it's come up short due to sectarianism, infighting, and division, and made it very difficult to achieve some of the outcomes that are necessary. You know, Mike, I'll give compliments to you because I'm familiar with your work with the May Day Coalition and the work you and John and other comrades are looking to do to drive some of these changes. But I've also seen other groups destroy. Groups like the Boston Socialist Unity Project, for example, that was organized to bring left groups together in a united way. And the difference, I'll say, in terms of united front and the popular front, though, is when we get together in a united front, for some reason, sectarianism seems to get in the way, and we get into ideological disputes over what type of Marxism is best, and we don't get anything done, versus having to work with other more liberal, progressive groups in a popular way to achieve democratic legislative reforms. And oftentimes that's what the Communist Party seeks to do too. We recognize the challenges of organizing with other left groups in a united way. And that big challenge, and this is some folks, we got to be honest with ourselves, is sectarianism. We over-intellectualize who we are and why we can't work with each other. And we fight and fight and fight so much with each other that I'm just going to say this, we don't get shit done because we're too much pulling out goddamn books that no one is even reading anymore, except for maybe 3 or 4 of us on this panel. And that's it.
Thank you, Eddie. I'd like to get to a few chat box space questions before maybe having one more voiced question. So some questions in the chat. There's a few directed at Rui, so I wanted to just string these together. The first one comes from Justin R. Justin says, Rui, you mentioned the need for a safe state strategy where the left votes for Biden in states contested by Trump with the caveat of condemnation. However, this election, following the last, challenges our notion of what counts as a safe state. States like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia are possibly contested this election. Does the conception behind this safe state approach perhaps naturalize what we understand as safe constituencies for both the Democrats and Republicans in a time when they may be rapidly shifting? Does the shifting of constituencies of both capitalist parties indicate a deeper crisis of American politics as we understand them? And then from Ethan Kaimana, also for Rui, he says, in your opening remarks, you denounced popular frontism and yet also call for a Biden electoral victory. Does this not constitute an alignment with bourgeois liberalism? Does it not lead to the same results? So I'll first hand it over to Rui to respond to those directly.
Okay, those are great questions. Okay, I'm sorry, my brain is just kind of going a little kaput right now. Could you very briefly remind me what Justin's questions are, since I can't see them in the chat?
Justin's was specifically getting at this notion of what constitutes a safe state in a broader sense. Yeah.
Okay, I got it. So I will first respond with this idea of what the safe state is. I mean, I think we should be able to look at, there is 538, which has a pretty accurate, all things considered, data map of the election. Obviously, it was wrong in 2016, but by one polling year. That like shifts, I think, to what is a safe state and what is a swing state pretty well. The development of the Democratic Party is an eclectic one, right? It's not made of a proletarian base, not really. In fact, ever since the loss of McGovern, it seems, the Democratic Party has been wheeling away, even more so in the neoliberal turn in the 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union, and basically every Marxist-Leninist state has been turning away from that into a sort of cultural significance. And the data we have for that is the fact that it was education that was one of the biggest factors, other than maybe race, as to how you were going to vote in terms of parties. That is incredibly strange if we have a class-based party, which the Democrats are not. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at. I hope I sort of answered one of the failures of the Democrats and why they've been so conservative has probably been because of this. It doesn't have a class basis. It only casts aspersions to that. And this kind of gets onto the next question about, my God, if we call for any sort of, if we hope that Biden wins or even support him in these, swing states, does that constitute popular frontism? I think if we were campaigning or being uncritical of Biden, it would. There is a very obvious goal of ameliorating the evils of a Trump administration, apart from the fact that, right now people are joining DSA because they're finding the failure of the Democratic opposition to Trump. That we can all agree on. These recent judicial hearings, I think, point to that. But we've also noticed is that I don't think we will be able to build towards a socialist movement that can actually threaten capital unless people get away from their aspersions in the Democrats, which in a sense requires them to come to power. Most of the socialist development has actually occurred because of Obama's failure in the bailout in the Occupy movement, which was a distinctly democratic administration thing that's occurring. I think the question you're asking does merit constant reconsideration so that we don't fall into popular frontism. But I think
Thank you,
what
Rui.
we can see right now is a principled analysis on the subject.
Thank you, Rui. For the sake of time, I want to get one more question out there before letting the other panelists respond immediately. I want to get one more question out, and you can treat this last question as your closing remarks, let's say, as we close out here. So the last question we have from Brock Lewis.
All right. Hey, everybody. So this is, I specifically had a question for Comrade Carson, but I mean, anybody who would be free to comment on it, obviously. So briefly, Carson mentioned a legislative path to socialism, and I'm curious about what he thinks that might look like. And secondly, I'm just curious broadly about how cooperation with the Democratic Party aids the Communist Party in creating class consciousness in the American proletariat.
So, and I want to string this with just one more question from the chat that I think helps blow this up a little bit more into a broad question of tactics and strategy, because we have talked about the defensive character of popular frontism in terms of it being a kind of a defense rather than an aspirational one. But there's also a way in which all these, whether it's the United Front or the Popular Front, at their best, they are aiming at revolution, right? I mean, that it's maybe defense in the aim of revolution. And so, but that still begs the question, if defeating fascism leads to revolution, that's great. But the 20th century seems to have proved definitively, in a certain sense, that this tactic hasn't worked for the goal of revolution. So why resurrect it at all? So just to open that up as well on top of what Brock has asked. And like I said, just treat this as your last comments in the last 30 seconds or so each, please. Thank you. Let's have Jack or Eddie, who wants to respond first? Okay, Eddie.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. My apologies. Hey, Brock, that's a great question. So there are a couple things that I'll point out there. A couple things in terms of some of the legislative processes that's here. One, I'll say this. Will has a good point. We've made these attempts, and it's been kind of like running in circles and circles and circles over and over again in terms of the question of how close are we getting to progress towards having a socialist state. Yet I remind ourselves too that while over the last 30 years we've seen setbacks towards Voting Rights Act and different other capacity that's there, we've also seen a step forward in terms of trans liberation, gay liberation, that's higher too. We've seen some of those things happen, and yet we've been met mainly by the discontent of groups to get behind a candidate who's going to endorse things for the notions of identity politics. It is true that the Democratic Party is made up of really a wide spectrum of different folks of different classes and everything, but yet the reality too is while class is fundamental for left orientation, we can't dismiss the realities of identity politics and the fact that, I'm working class, brother, but I'm also a Black man. We got folks who are working class folks who may be gay, who may be trans, who may not be able-bodied, but yet part of our work too, it has to be moving towards legislative processes to protect the identity of those populations. And yeah, I don't want to go back to what Will said. Oftentimes that can be a setback towards achieving the ultimate goal of socialism and moving society closer and closer toward progress. But yet the reality too is, how do we get there without leaving people behind? Because certain people have certain levels of various privileges that are there too.
Thank you, Eddie. And let's just, for the sake of time, I want to respect our attendees. Let's just have George and Jack, if you could just give a minute, if you'd like, of closing responses to this question. So George, did you have something?
I wanted, first of all, to thank everybody for participating in this discussion. I just think the classical difference between a popular front and a united front was the Communist Party's leadership of a united front. And there are still organizations that follow that model and what they're trying to build. And I think, with the looming crisis in the United States, because no matter who wins the election, this country's got terrific problems that are not going to go away. I mean, the environment, the assault on, our bodies from the virus is part of this. And I just worry that the opportunities for authoritarian tendencies, not simply on the left, of course, but on the right, the left, wherever, are very significant in the coming period. And the idea of a popular front, which gives flexibility of action and local control, is a very good one.
Thank you, George. Jack, any last word before we leave? All right, so with that, thank you very much to all our panelists, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. And well, once again, if you'd like to be included on our emailing list or get involved in Platypus activities, please sign up at the following link that I'm going to drop again into the chat. All right. So once again, thanks to the panelists, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.